Mark Wilson's arthritic fingers froze on the shelter door handle, the German shepherd's leash suddenly heavy in his other hand. What had begun as a simple return, an old man admitting defeat, shattered when he noticed the peculiar scars beneath Max's fur collar. Sarah Mitchell's clipboard clattered to the floor, her face draining of color as Mark pointed to the marks. "Those aren't from the collar." "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," she whispered, glancing around the empty reception area. "There's something about this dog's previous owner you should know, Mr. Wilson." The overhead fluorescent light buzzed mercilessly as Max pressed his massive body against Mark's leg, trembling. 5 years since Mary's death had taught Mark to recognize fear, the same fear now reflected in both the dog's eyes and Sarah's. "Who did this to him?" Mark demanded, his retirement-softened voice finding its forgotten strength. What darkness had this animal escaped, and was Mark truly ready to face it at 68? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Tucson, Arizona shimmered under the merciless July heat as Mark Wilson eased himself into the weathered rocking chair on his front porch. His modest home and Sunnyside retirement community stood as a testament to downscaling, too much space for one person since Mary had passed. 5 years felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Mark sipped his morning coffee, wincing slightly as arthritis complained in his knuckles. At 68, his 6-foot frame remained impressive, though now stooped from decades of leaning over construction plans. The hands that had once directed the building of Tucson's tallest structures now struggled with jar lids and doorknobs. The neighborhood stirred to life around him. Retirees walking small dogs, newspaper deliveries, the occasional grandchild visitor. Mark nodded politely when necessary but rarely engaged. His neighbors had stopped inviting him to community barbecues after the third refusal. "You should get yourself a dog," Mary had suggested in those final weeks, her voice thin but her mind still sharp. "Something to take care of when I'm gone." He'd dismissed the idea then. What did he know about dogs? Buildings were his expertise. Concrete, steel, things that stayed where you put them. Inside, Mark's home told the story of a life half-lived. Mary's reading chair remained untouched, her gardening magazine still stacked beside it. The kitchen gleamed with disuse. Meals had become functional rather than pleasurable. TV dinners and coffee sustained him physically, while PBS documentaries filled the silence. Financial concerns shadowed his retirement. The economic downturn had taken a third of his savings, and Mary's medical bills another third. His Social Security check stretched thin across utilities, medication, and the occasional treat of breakfast at Denny's, where the waitresses still called him honey or sweetheart. Most days blended together in a haze of sameness. Wake up, coffee, newspaper, television, sleep, wake up. He'd built monuments of steel and glass that would outlast him, yet his own life had shrunk to the 4 walls around him. The advertisement had caught his eye 3 weeks ago. A local shelter overcrowded with animals needing homes. "Senior pets for senior citizens," the tagline read, promising companionship without the decade-long commitment of a puppy. Something in the sad eyes of the German shepherd in the photo had triggered a long-dormant response in Mark. "Maybe Mary was right," he had muttered to himself, reaching for the phone. "Maybe it's time." Now, with Max cowering in his bedroom, Mark wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. How could a man who could barely take care of himself properly handle a traumatized animal? Yet something about the dog's fearful eyes reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror, existing, but not living. The Pima County Animal Shelter smelled of disinfectant and wet dog fur. Mark Wilson shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair as he waited, application form balanced on his knee. Around him, the cacophony of barks and meows created a symphony of need that made his chest tighten. "Mr. Wilson?" A woman approached, hand extended. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Senior Adoption Coordinator. Thank you for considering one of our rescues." Sarah was perhaps 45, with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who had learned to make every second count. Her khaki uniform bore the badges of various animal welfare organizations, and a lanyard of keys jingled at her hip. "Just looking," Mark said, his voice gruffer than intended. "Been alone a while. Thought maybe—" Sarah smiled. "Sometimes the right companion makes all the difference. Any particular type of dog you had in mind?" Mark shrugged. "Something quiet, not too big. Nothing that needs more energy than I've got left." "Let me show you around," Sarah said, leading him through a door into the kennels proper. The noise amplified tenfold, and Mark winced. Dogs of all sizes pressed against chain-link doors, tails wagging desperately for attention. Sarah introduced each potential candidate: a beagle mix with sad eyes, an elderly poodle missing a leg, a terrier that bounced like it was spring-loaded. None sparked any connection in Mark's heart. As they reached the end of the row, Mark noticed a kennel Sarah had bypassed. Unlike the others, this dog wasn't at the front begging for attention. A large German shepherd huddled in the back corner, amber eyes watching them warily. "What about that one?" Mark asked. Sarah hesitated. "Max is complicated. He came in 3 weeks ago, found wandering near the highway. No collar, but microchipped. When we contacted the registered owner, they claimed they'd sold him years ago and didn't know the new owner's information." Something about the dog's posture, alert yet withdrawn, reminded Mark of himself. "Can I see him?" Sarah looked uncertain. "He's not great with strangers, especially men. We think he may have been abused." "I've got time," Mark said, surprising himself with his patience. Sarah opened the kennel door cautiously, speaking in soft tones to the German shepherd. "This is Max. About 3 years old, according to our vet. He's healthy physically, but—" The dog pressed himself further into the corner, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Mark slowly lowered himself to sit on the concrete floor, ignoring the protest from his knees. "Hey there, fella," he said quietly. "Not gonna hurt you." For 20 minutes, Mark simply sat there, occasionally speaking in low tones about nothing in particular: the weather, the Diamondbacks' chances this season, how his coffee maker had broken that morning. The dog watched, never moving closer but gradually ceasing to growl. "That's actually the longest he's gone without growling at a man," Sarah remarked. "You must have a way with animals." Mark snorted. "Never had pets. Mary, my wife, was allergic." By the end of the visit, Max had inched forward slightly, nose working overtime to assess Mark from a distance. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't outright rejection either. "The adoption process includes a home check," Sarah explained as they walked back to reception. "There's also a 2-week trial period to make sure it's a good match." Max would need patience, consistency, and probably some professional training. Mark found himself filling out paperwork, answering questions about his living situation, experience with dogs, none, and why he wanted to adopt. He couldn't articulate it clearly, just that something in the dog's wariness had called to him. 3 days later, Sarah arrived at his home, clipboard in hand. She inspected his fenced backyard, nodding approvingly at the shade trees and covered patio. Inside, she noted potential hazards: cords that might be chewed, small objects that could be swallowed. "It's a good setup for a dog," she concluded. "Quiet neighborhood, not too much traffic, and you're home most of the day, which Max needs. He has severe separation anxiety." By the weekend, Mark found himself at PetSmart, pushing a cart filled with dog beds, food bowls, premium kibble, and toys he wasn't sure would ever be played with. The bill made him wince, nearly a week's worth of Social Security, but he handed over his credit card without comment. Max arrived the following Monday, transported in Sarah's personal vehicle rather than the shelter van. "Less traumatic this way," she explained, gently coaxing the reluctant shepherd from the back seat. Mark had expected some fanfare, some moment of connection, but Max slunk past him into the house, immediately seeking the darkest corner of the living room to claim as his own. "Give him time," Sarah advised. "Don't force interaction. Let him come to you." The first 3 days were exercises in patience. Max ate only when Mark left the room, used the backyard for necessities but rushed back inside and flinched at every sudden movement. At night he paced restlessly, occasionally emitting low whines that woke Mark from his already fitful sleep. By day 4, Mark was questioning his decision. He'd never felt so incompetent. Buildings were predictable, dogs were not. And he sat at his kitchen table, laptop open to a senior pet owners forum, scrolling through advice on traumatized animals. "Hand feeding builds trust," one post suggested. That evening, Mark sat on the floor, 6 feet from Max's corner, a piece of boiled chicken in his outstretched palm. An hour passed. His back screamed. His knees locked. Just as he was about to give up, Max inched forward, took the chicken with surgical precision, and retreated. Mark smiled his first genuine smile in months. Progress came in microscopic increments. Max accepting food more readily. Max sleeping through part of the night. Max watching television from 10 feet away instead of 15. Then came the nightmares. Mark awoke at 3 a.m. to howling, not barking, but a soul-deep sound of terror. He found Max trembling violently in his corner, eyes wide and unseeing. "It's okay, boy," Mark soothed, keeping his distance. "You're safe here." The pattern repeated nightly. Mark began researching PTSD in dogs, printing articles, making notes. The delivery man's knock sent Max into a frenzy of barking and hiding. The neighbor's teenage son caused similar reactions. Male voices at certain volumes, the jingle of metal tags on his collar. Specific triggers, Mark noted, not general fear. After 2 weeks of minimal sleep and maximum worry, the UPS driver's arrival triggered Max's most violent reaction yet. Lunging, teeth bared, hackles raised, Mark barely managed to grab his collar, straining against the powerful animal's fear-driven strength. That night, Mark called Sarah. "I don't think I can do this," he admitted, shame coloring his voice. "He needs someone who knows what they're doing." "You've already made more progress than most would," Sarah countered. "But if you're sure—" "I'll bring him back tomorrow," Mark said, looking at Max huddled under the dining room table. "It's not fair to him." That night, unable to sleep, Mark decided Max needed a bath before returning to the shelter. A final kindness. As warm water soaked through the thick fur, Mark's fingers found more scars, thin lines across the ribs, a notch in one ear, a patch where fur grew white instead of tan and black. "What happened to you, boy?" he murmured. Max stood rigid, tolerating the bath without enjoyment. As Mark toweled him dry, he noticed how the dog flinched when the metal tags on his new collar clinked together. The next morning, Mark stood at the shelter door, Max's leash in hand, fighting an unexpected reluctance to follow through. That's when he noticed the pattern of scars around Max's neck, partially hidden by his fur collar. "Those don't look like accidental injuries," he said to Sarah as they stood in the reception area. Sarah's clipboard clattered to the floor, her face suddenly pale. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," she admitted. "There's something about this dog's previous owner you should know, Mr. Wilson." Mark's hand tightened on the leash, and for the first time Max pressed against his leg instead of pulling away. "Let's talk in my office," Sarah said, glancing nervously at the shelter volunteers within earshot. She led Mark and Max down a narrow hallway to a cramped room overflowing with filing cabinets and dog training manuals. Max settled reluctantly at Mark's feet, amber eyes tracking Sarah's every movement. "The scars you found," Sarah began, closing the door. "They're consistent with a specific type of training collar, but used improperly or deliberately misused." Mark's weathered hand instinctively moved to Max's head. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. Someone hurt him on purpose? We suspected as much when he arrived. His reactions are too specific. The metal sounds, men with deep voices, certain commands. Sarah pulled a folder from her desk. I should have been more forthcoming, but we've had people adopt difficult dogs just to return them a week later. I wanted to see if you'd stick it out. Mark felt a flicker of irritation at being tested, quickly replaced by concern for the animal pressing against his leg. Who would do this to a dog? That's what I'd like to find out, Sarah replied. The microchip registration was a dead end, or so I thought. But there's something else we can try. She hesitated. Would you be willing to take Max to a veterinarian I know? Dr. Emily Johnson specializes in rescue animals and might be able to tell us more about his background. 2 hours later, Mark sat in an examination room at Desert Paws Veterinary Clinic, watching Dr. Johnson, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, gently examine Max. Unlike most vets Mark had encountered, she wore jeans and work boots under her lab coat and spoke to Max in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm him. These scars aren't random, she confirmed, pointing to marks on Max's neck and back. Some are from a prong collar used with excessive force. Others? She frowned. I'm not entirely sure, but there's something interesting about his microchip. She pressed a handheld scanner against Max's shoulder blades. Standard shelter chips emit a simple numeric code. This one's different, encrypted, military grade. I've only seen this type once before on a dog that worked with a private security contractor. Mark frowned. What does that mean? It means, Dr. Johnson said carefully, that Max likely wasn't just someone's pet. He was an investment, trained for something specific. She reached for her phone. I know someone who might be able to decode this chip. Give me a few days. On the drive home, Mark found himself watching Max in the rearview mirror. The German Shepherd sat alert in the back seat, eyes tracking the passing landscape with military precision. Not just a pet, Mark thought. Something more complicated. 3 days passed. Mark canceled his standing appointment at the senior center's coffee morning to wait for Dr. Johnson's call. When his phone finally rang, he answered before the first ring completed. Mr. Wilson, Emily Johnson here. My contact was able to trace that chip. Her voice carried an edge that put Mark on alert. The original registration belongs to a Thomas Reed. Does that name mean anything to you? Mark shook his head before remembering she couldn't see him. No. Should it? Thomas Reed is something of a local celebrity, decorated veteran, runs a foundation supporting returned servicemen. There was a feature about him in the Arizona Daily Star last month. Hometown hero continues to serve. Mark reached for his laptop, typing the name with hunt and peck precision. The search results displayed a handsome man in his mid-50s, silver hair cropped short in a military cut, standing before a group of veterans. The headline confirmed Dr. Johnson's description, Hometown hero Thomas Reed expands Veterans Support Foundation. Why would a hometown hero abandon a dog? Mark wondered aloud. That's not all, Dr. Johnson continued. My contact did some digging. Reed also runs a dog training business on the side, specialized training for security and protection work. Something cold settled in Mark's stomach. He looked at Max, now sleeping on his new bed in the corner of the living room, legs twitching in dreams. What kind of training? The legal kind, supposedly, but Max's reaction suggests something else might have been happening. After ending the call, Mark spent hours researching Thomas Reed. The man's credentials were impressive. 20 years in the Army Special Forces, Bronze Star recipient, founder of the Reed Foundation for Veteran Support. His social media showed him at charity galas, shaking hands with the mayor, receiving awards for community service. One photo caught Mark's attention. Reed standing proudly beside a German shepherd that looked remarkably like Max, though this dog stood tall and confident, not cowering. The caption read, "Thor completing advanced protection training. Another success for Reed Canine Academy." Thor. Was that Max's original name? Mark picked up the phone and called Sarah at the shelter. "Did you know Max belonged to Thomas Reed?" he asked without preamble. The silence that followed was answer enough. "You did know," Mark concluded. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah sighed. "It's complicated, Mr. Wilson. Reed has a lot of influence in this town. When Max was brought in, the police contacted Reed since he was the registered owner. He claimed he'd sold the dog years ago and didn't know how it ended up stray. You didn't believe him." "I had my doubts," Sarah admitted. "But without proof, there's nothing we could do." Reed threatened to sue the shelter for defamation when one of our volunteers questioned his story. Mark glanced at Max, now awake and watching him intently. "I need to know more." The next morning, Mark called an old acquaintance, Frank Miller, a retired police officer he'd met years ago when designing the new precinct building. Frank agreed to meet at a diner far from downtown, where they were unlikely to encounter anyone connected to Reed. Frank looked older than Mark remembered, his once solid frame now softened around the middle, but his eyes remained sharp as he slid into the booth. "Been a while, Wilson. Heard you finally retired." 5 years ago, Mark confirmed. "Thanks for meeting me." "Sounded important on the phone. What's this about Thomas Reed?" Mark explained his situation with Max, the strange microchip, the scars, and the specific fear triggers. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a napkin. "Reed's got a spotless reputation," Frank said when Mark finished. "Raises millions for veterans, never been in trouble with the law, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" "There were rumors, back when I was still on the force. Nothing concrete, nothing we could investigate officially. Just whispers about dogs being trained for more than protection work." Frank leaned forward. "You ever hear of dog-fighting rings?" Mark felt sick. "You think Reed is involved in dog-fighting?" "I'm not saying anything definite," Frank cautioned. "But those scars you described, the behavior patterns, they're consistent with dogs rescued from fighting operations. And Reed's property out past the city limits would be the perfect location. Remote, private. If that's true, why hasn't anyone investigated?" Frank's smile was bitter. "Who's going to investigate the town's biggest philanthropist on the word of a few animal control officers? Without hard evidence, it's career suicide." As Mark drove home, his mind raced. The respected veteran and community leader, running an illegal dogfighting operation? It seemed impossible. Yet Max's behavior, his scars, his terror of certain triggers, it all pointed to systematic abuse. Mark made a detour, driving past the gleaming office building housing the Reed Foundation. The modern glass structure bore little resemblance to the rundown shelters Mark had imagined when thinking of veteran support services. A man emerged from the building, tall, silver-haired, moving with military precision. Even from a distance, Mark recognized Thomas Reed from his photos. Without conscious thought, Mark found himself parking across the street, watching as Reed spoke with a security guard before climbing into a luxury SUV. On impulse, Mark followed the vehicle, maintaining a careful distance. Reed drove to an upscale restaurant where he joined a group of well-dressed men and women for lunch. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of the ordinary for a successful businessman. Mark was about to leave when Reed emerged from the restaurant, shaking hands with his companions. Something about his body language changed once they departed, the warm smile fading to a cold efficiency that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Instead of returning to his office, Reed drove to a nondescript warehouse on the industrial side of town. He punched a code into a keypad, and the large bay door rolled open just enough for his SUV to slip inside. Mark waited 30 minutes, then approached the warehouse on foot. No company name marked the building, just a street number. Through a dirty window he glimpsed cages, rows of them. Most appeared empty, but in one a large dog paced restlessly. Backing away, Mark nearly collided with a man in worker's overalls. "Help you with something?" the man asked, eyes suspicious. "Just looking for Reed K-9 Academy," Mark improvised. "Is this the right place?" The man's expression shifted subtly. "Training facilities out of town. This is just storage." "My mistake," Mark said, retreating to his car. His heart pounded in his chest, a reminder of the cardiac event that had hastened his retirement 3 years earlier. This was madness, a 68-year-old man playing detective. Yet when he returned home and saw Max cowering at the sound of his neighbor's power tools, something hardened in Mark's resolve. This dog had suffered at human hands, perhaps those of the very man the community celebrated as a hero. Mark called Sarah. "I need to know everything you have on Reed," he said without preamble. "And I'm not returning Max to the shelter. Whatever happened to him, I won't let it happen again." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," Sarah replied, a new respect in her voice. "There's something I need to tell you, Mr. Wilson, something about me and about Thomas Reed." Sarah arrived at Mark's house just after sunset, her usual confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy. She paced Mark's living room, stopping occasionally to glance out the window as if expecting to be followed. Max watched her from his corner, more alert than fearful. "I should have told you from the beginning," Sarah began, declining Mark's offer of coffee. "Thomas Reed is my uncle." Mark sat heavily in his recliner. "Your uncle? And you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" "It's why I work at the shelter," she continued, ignoring his accusatory tone. 3 years ago, I visited his training facility. What I saw there," she shuddered. "Dogs kept in conditions no animal should endure. Training methods that were nothing short of torture. When I confronted him, he reminded me that family loyalty should come first." "So instead of reporting him, you got a job at the shelter?" Mark's voice hardened. Sarah's eyes flashed. "I did report him. Anonymously. But nothing happened. My uncle has friends in the police department, the mayor's office, everywhere that matters. So I changed tactics. I started working to save the dogs he discarded when they didn't meet his standards." Mark studied her face, looking for deception but finding only pain. "And Max?" "When he came in, I recognized him immediately. One of Reed's prize prospects that suddenly disappeared from the training program. I knew if Reed found out Max was at the shelter, he'd reclaim him or worse." Sarah's voice broke. "I've been trying to gather evidence against my uncle for years, but he's careful. The dogs that survive his program are sold to private collectors or overseas clients. The ones that don't—" Mark felt sick. "Why tell me this now?" "Because you're asking questions, being seen around the warehouse. Reed has eyes everywhere. If he discovers you have Max, you could be in danger." Sarah leaned forward. "I need to know if you're serious about helping Max, because it might involve more than you bargained for." Over the next 2 weeks, Mark established a new routine with Max. Each morning began with gentle training exercises, sitting, staying, walking calmly on a leash. Nothing demanding, nothing that triggered the German Shepherd's anxiety. Mark discovered that Max responded well to hand signals, but cowered at certain verbal commands. "It's like he knows 2 different languages," Mark explained to Frank during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. "Say sit gently, he's fine. Say it sharply, or in what sounds like German, he goes into panic mode." "Dual command training," Frank nodded. "Common in protection dogs. One set of commands for normal behavior, another for attack or defense work. Question is, what was Reed training him to do?" As Max's trust grew, so did his confidence. The first time the dog wagged his tail, a brief, hesitant movement, Mark felt a surge of accomplishment greater than when he'd completed his first skyscraper design. The first time Max voluntarily approached him for attention, Mark found himself blinking back tears. "Mary would have loved you," he told the dog, scratching behind ears that no longer flattened in fear. "She always said I needed someone to take care of." Financial reality soon intruded on their developing bond. Max's specialized food, anxiety medication, and upcoming dental work, neglected during his previous life, strained Mark's fixed income. After paying the first veterinary bill, he opened his checkbook to discover he couldn't cover both the electric bill and his heart medication. Without hesitation, Mark wrote the check for the electric company and placed his heart pills back in the cabinet. "Just until next month's Social Security check," he assured Max, who watched him with seemingly understanding eyes. That night, Mark removed Mary's jewelry from the safe in his closet. She'd always told him to sell it if he needed the money after she was gone. "It's just metal and stones," she'd said. "Can't take it with me." Still, his hands trembled as he placed her wedding ring in a separate box. Everything else would go to the pawn shop, but that one memento he would keep. The pawn shop yielded enough cash to cover his medication and a few extras for Max: a more comfortable bed, a harness to replace the collar that triggered anxiety, and sessions with a trainer specializing in rehabilitation. Mark ate peanut butter sandwiches for a week and didn't regret it for a moment. Sarah continued providing information about Reed's operation. "He calls it Veterans and Canines, supposedly pairing service dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD," she explained over coffee in Mark's kitchen. "The legitimate side of the business does exactly that. But the dogs that don't make the cut for service work, they go to the warehouse," Mark finished, "or the property outside town. That's where the real training happens." Mark had driven past Reed's rural property twice now, a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Nothing visible from the road indicated anything sinister, but the level of security seemed excessive for a dog training facility. One evening, Frank arrived at Mark's house with a manila envelope. "Called in some favors," he said, spreading photographs across the kitchen table. "These were taken 6 months ago during a tax assessment of Reed's property." The aerial photos showed the main house, outbuildings, and something else: a circular structure partially hidden by trees. "Looks like an arena," Frank pointed out, "consistent with known dogfighting setups." "Still not enough for a warrant," Mark guessed. Frank nodded grimly. "Reed's too smart, too connected. We need something irrefutable." Their opportunity came unexpectedly. Reed's Foundation announced a fundraising gala, Heroes and Hounds, featuring demonstrations by his service dogs. The event would be held at Reed's rural property, offering a rare glimpse inside the compound. "It's perfect," Sarah said excitedly. "You can attend as a potential donor. No one will question your presence." Mark raised an eyebrow. And why would Thomas Reed believe a retired construction engineer on a fixed income could make a significant donation? Sarah smiled. "Because you designed the Thomas and Eleanor Reed Veterans Memorial Bridge. You're already connected to his family legacy, even if you don't know it." Mark stared at her in confusion. "The pedestrian bridge connecting the Veterans Memorial to the city park," Sarah explained, "named after my grandparents, Reed's parents. My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran who died from complications related to Agent Orange exposure." The revelation added another layer of complexity to the already complicated situation. Mark had indeed designed that bridge 15 years earlier, one of his proudest achievements, combining function with a tribute to veterans. "Reed won't remember me," Mark argued. "I never met him during the project." "Trust me," Sarah insisted. "Drop that connection, and he'll welcome you with open arms." The night of the gala, Mark dressed in his only suit, slightly too large now that retirement had trimmed his frame. He felt ridiculous and exposed, an old man walking into the lion's den. Max seemed to sense his anxiety, pressing against his leg before Mark left. "I'll be back," he promised the dog, "and maybe with answers." Reed's property was transformed for the evening, valet parking, string lights in the trees, waiters circulating with champagne. Mark felt increasingly out of place among the wealthy donors and local celebrities. He was considering leaving when a strong hand clasped his shoulder. "Mark Wilson, isn't it? The bridge designer?" Mark turned to face Thomas Reed himself, taller in person, with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to authority. His smile seemed genuine, but his eyes remained calculating, assessing. "Mr. Reed, yes. That was one of my projects." "One of your best," Reed replied smoothly. "My father would have been honored. He always said we need to build more bridges, literal and figurative." He guided Mark toward a quieter area of the gathering. "Sarah mentioned you might attend tonight. I'm glad you could make it." Mark's pulse quickened. "Sarah?" "My niece. She works at the animal shelter, a family tradition of service, though in a different direction than mine." Reed's expression revealed nothing. "She mentioned you've recently adopted a dog. How's that working out for you?" The casual question carried the weight of a trap. Mark forced a smile. "Getting used to having company again. Nothing special. Just an old mutt that needed a home." Reed nodded, seemingly satisfied with the vague answer. "The right dog can change a person's life. That's what our program is about. Second chances for dogs and veterans alike." As if on cue, handlers appeared with several German shepherds, each moving with perfect precision. Reed directed them into a demonstration of service dog capabilities, retrieving dropped items, providing stability for a limping veteran, even alerting to a simulated panic attack. "Impressive," Mark commented, genuinely moved by the bond between the dogs and their handlers. "This is just the public face of our work," Reed replied, lowering his voice. "Some of our training is more specialized, for clients with unique security needs." The demonstration concluded to enthusiastic applause. As the crowd dispersed toward the dinner tent, Reed placed a hand on Mark's arm. "Would you like to see our training facilities? Not everyone gets the private tour." Every instinct warned Mark to decline, but this was exactly the opportunity they needed. "I'd be honored." Reed led him past the main kennels where visitors cooed over puppies in training. They continued to a separate building set apart from the others, accessible only through a keypad-secured door. Inside, the atmosphere changed dramatically, sterile, serious, with none of the homey touches of the public spaces. Dogs in these kennels were different too, intense, focused, watching their surroundings with military alertness. One German shepherd in particular caught Mark's attention, physically identical to Max but carrying himself with aggressive confidence. "That's Brutus," Reed said, following Mark's gaze. "Brother to Thor, one of our most promising trainees until he disappeared from the program." Mark's mouth went dry. "What happened to him?" Reed's expression darkened. "Someone stole him. Valuable dog, specially bred for certain traits. We had interest from overseas buyers." He studied Mark's face. "Strange thing, he turned up at the local shelter recently. Sarah was supposed to notify me immediately if he ever appeared, but somehow that notification never came." The threat hung in the air between them. Mark maintained what he hoped was a neutral expression. "Sounds like a communication breakdown." "Indeed." Reed's smile returned, cold and professional. "Communication is essential in my line of work, Mr. Wilson. When instructions aren't followed, consequences follow." Before Mark could respond, Reed's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowning. "Excuse me. Something requires my attention." "Feel free to explore the public areas, but these facilities are now closing for the evening." As Reed strode away, Mark released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The encounter confirmed his suspicions. Reed knew about Max, knew Sarah had deliberately kept the information from him, and now, possibly, suspected Mark's involvement. Mark made his way back to the main event, mind racing. He needed to warn Sarah, needed to protect Max. As he reached for his phone, a younger man approached, Reed's assistant according to his name badge. "Mr. Wilson, Mr. Reed asked me to show you something before you leave. This way, please." Against his better judgment, Mark followed the assistant toward a utility building partially hidden by landscaping. The young man, Michael, according to his badge, opened the door and gestured Mark inside. "Mr. Reed thought you might find this interesting, given your concern for animal welfare." The room contained filing cabinets and a desk with a computer monitor. Michael typed briefly, then turned the screen toward Mark. "Training footage, very specialized." The video showed a circular pit, the same structure visible in the aerial photographs. Inside, 2 German shepherds fought viciously while men shouted and exchanged cash. Mark felt bile rise in his throat as he recognized one of the dogs. The distinctive markings matched Max perfectly. "This is illegal," Mark managed, backing toward the door. Michael nodded. "Yes, sir, it is. And now, you have a decision to make." He handed Mark a flash drive. "This contains enough evidence to shut down Mr. Reed's operation. The question is whether you're brave enough to use it." "Why are you showing me this?" Mark demanded. "Because someone needs to stop him," Michael replied simply. "And you seem to care about these dogs more than most." As Mark drove home, the flash drive felt like a live grenade in his pocket. His hands shook on the steering wheel, not just from the arthritis, but from fear and anger in equal measure. The images from the video played on repeat in his mind. Max, forced to fight for the entertainment and profit of men like Reed. Max greeted him at the door with newfound enthusiasm, circling his legs and sniffing his clothes curiously. Mark knelt, despite protesting knees, and hugged the dog tightly. "I know what happened to you," he whispered into the thick fur, "and I swear it won't happen again." The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., jarring Mark from uneasy sleep. Max's ears perked up instantly, his body tensing beside Mark's bed where he had recently begun sleeping. "Hello?" Mark's voice was thick with interrupted sleep. "Mind your own business, old man." The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. "The dog doesn't belong to you. Never did." Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. He sat in the darkness, heart pounding erratically in his chest. Beside him, Max whined softly, pressing against his leg as if offering comfort. "It's okay, boy," Mark murmured, though the tremor in his hand as he stroked Max's head suggested otherwise. Someone knew about his investigation, about Max, about the flash drive now hidden in a coffee can in his kitchen. Mark didn't return to sleep. Instead, he sat in his recliner with Max at his feet, watching as dawn gradually illuminated his modest living room. By the time the morning newspaper hit his driveway, he had made several decisions, each more dangerous than the last. First, he called Frank, relating the threatening call in detail. "Reed's sending a message," Frank confirmed. "You've become a problem he needs to solve." "What would you do?" Mark asked, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. Frank's sigh carried through the phone line. "As your friend, I'd tell you to return the dog and forget everything you've seen. As a former cop who's watched too many criminals walk free, I'd say gather every scrap of evidence you can." After disconnecting, Mark phoned Sarah, arranging to meet at a coffee shop far from both the shelter and Reed's foundation. Her face paled as he described the threatening call and revealed the flash drive Michael had provided. "This could be enough," she whispered, fingers itching toward the small device Mark kept firmly in his pocket. "But it's also dangerous. Michael is risking everything by giving you this." Why would Reed's assistant betray him? Mark questioned. Sarah's eyes dropped to her untouched coffee. Michael was a veteran in Reed's program first. PTSD, honorable discharge. Reed promised him healing through working with the dogs. Her voice hardened. Instead, he gradually pulled Michael into the fighting operation, exploiting his vulnerability and need for purpose. Mark nodded slowly. The manipulation sounded eerily familiar, Reed identifying weakness and twisting it to his advantage. We need to take this to the authorities. Not yet, Sarah cautioned. Reed has connections throughout local law enforcement. We need federal involvement, FBI or ASPCA investigators. And we need more than just the video. We need financial records showing illegal gambling, proof of interstate transport of fighting dogs. Mark's frustration mounted. How much more suffering is acceptable while we build the perfect case? Sarah had no answer. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 a.m. the following morning. Max immediately retreated to his safe space behind the couch, his reaction warning Mark before he reached the door. Through the peephole, Thomas Reed stood on his porch, alone but radiating authority in an impeccably tailored suit. Mark considered pretending to be absent, but Reed's gaze fixed knowingly on the peephole. "I can hear your breathing, Mr. Wilson," he called, voice pleasant. "Just a friendly neighborhood visit." Taking a deep breath, Mark opened the door but blocked the entrance with his body. "Mr. Reed, this is unexpected." Reed smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I thought we connected at the gala, and since I was in the neighborhood, I wanted to see this rescue dog Sarah mentioned. She speaks highly of your rehabilitation efforts." "Not a good time," Mark replied, matching Reed's false pleasantness. "The dog is still adjusting, doesn't do well with strangers." Reed's smile thinned. "That's precisely why I'm concerned. Some dogs, particularly those with specialized training, can be dangerous in inexperienced hands. As a community leader, I'd be remiss not to follow up on potential public safety issues." The standoff continued for several tense seconds before Reed sighed theatrically. "Let's dispense with the charade, Mr. Wilson. You have my dog, a valuable, specially trained animal that represents a significant investment. I want him back." "According to the shelter, he was abandoned," Mark countered, feeling sweat bead along his spine despite the morning chill. "And legally adopted by me. A clerical error. The dog, Thor, not Max, was reported stolen, not abandoned. I have the original police report." Reed extracted a folder from his leather briefcase. "I've been very patient, allowing Sarah's little rebellion to play out, but my patience has limits." Mark accepted the folder without opening it. "I'll have my lawyer review this." Reed's laugh was genuine but cold. "A retired engineer on Social Security against my legal team? Be realistic." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "That dog is worth more than you'll make in what's left of your miserable life. Return him within 72 hours, or I'll bring the full force of the law and other resources to bear." "Is that a threat?" Mark kept his voice steady despite the quickening of his pulse. "Merely stating facts. 72 hours, Mr. Wilson. After that, things become unpleasant for everyone." Reed turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and if you're considering using certain materials you may have acquired recently, remember that digital files can be manipulated. Your word against mine." "Who do you think people will believe?" After Reed's departure, Mark sank into his recliner, the folder unopened in his trembling hands. Max emerged cautiously from his hiding place, whining softly as he approached, sensing Mark's distress. "It's okay, boy," Mark assured him, the quaver in his voice betraying his words. "We're not giving up." The documents in Reed's folder appeared legitimate. A police report filed 6 months earlier claiming theft of a valuable service dog in training, veterinary records, purchased documentation from a specialized breeder in Germany. Mark wasn't fooled. Reed had likely created these records after discovering Max's location, backdating them to establish prior ownership. Mark called Frank immediately, relating the confrontation in detail. "He's given me 72 hours to surrender Max," he concluded. After that, you need to be careful," Frank finished grimly. "Reed doesn't make idle threats." "We need to move faster," Mark insisted. "The flash drive may not be enough," Frank interrupted. "We need to see what's happening at that property now, not just an old footage that could be dismissed as isolated incidents." That afternoon, Frank arrived with surveillance equipment that betrayed his continued connections to law enforcement: long-range cameras, recording devices, even night vision binoculars. "Borrowed from former colleagues who owe me favors," he explained, spreading the items across Mark's kitchen table. "We'll set up observation points around Reed's rural property." "We?" Mark questioned. Frank's expression softened. "You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you? I've been looking for a way to nail Reed for years. This might be our only chance." They spent hours planning, mapping observation points using satellite images of the area surrounding Reed's compound. Sarah joined them later, bringing additional information from shelter records: dogs that had arrived with injuries consistent with fighting, subsequently claimed by Reed or his associates. "The pattern is clear once you know what to look for," she explained, arranging photos of injured dogs in chronological order. "Every few months, damaged dogs appear, either as strays or surrendered anonymously. Reed claims the ones with potential for rehabilitation, the others—" She didn't need to finish the thought. The kill statistics from county shelters told the grim story. That night, Mark lay awake planning his next moves while Max slept fitfully beside him. The 72-hour deadline felt like a noose tightening around both their necks. In the morning, Mark made two decisions. First, he called his lawyer, an old friend who had handled Mary's estate, and updated his will, specifically including provisions for Max's care should anything happen to him. The attorney raised eyebrows at the urgency but complied without excessive questions. Second, Mark withdrew the remaining cash from his savings account, a mere $3,200 after Mary's medical bills, and his reduced retirement income had depleted what was once a comfortable nest egg. If things went badly, he might need to leave quickly, and cash left fewer traces than credit cards. The surveillance operation began that evening. Frank positioned himself in a hunting blind overlooking the main entrance to Reed's property, while Mark and Sarah parked on a service road backing up to the compound's northern boundary where the dense tree line provided cover. "Activity usually increases on Friday evenings," Sarah explained, adjusting the night vision binoculars. "That's when most of the fights happen. Wealthy clients, high-stakes gambling." For hours, they observed the compound. Cars arrived periodically, expensive vehicles with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. Mark documented each arrival with the camera Frank had provided, capturing license plates when possible. Shortly after midnight, the pattern changed. A large van with no windows arrived, parking near the outbuilding that housed the training facilities. Men emerged, unloading crates that clearly contained dogs, their barking audible even at this distance. "Those aren't service dogs," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with anger. "Look at how they're handling them." Through the binoculars, Mark watched men roughly dragging crates from the van, occasionally striking at the dogs inside when their barking grew too loud. The sick feeling in his stomach intensified as he recognized one of the handlers, Michael, Reed's assistant, who had provided the flash drive. "He's still part of it," Mark murmured, confusion evident in his tone. "He has to maintain his cover," Sarah reasoned. "If Reed suspected his loyalty—" A sudden movement along the fence line caught Mark's attention. Security guards with flashlights were patrolling the perimeter, one heading directly toward their observation position. "We need to go," he hissed, gathering the equipment with shaking hands. They retreated through the trees, trying to move silently despite the underbrush and Mark's arthritic knees. Behind them, shouts indicated their presence had been detected. Sarah helped Mark into the passenger seat of her car, tires spinning on gravel as she accelerated away from the property. "They made us," she said unnecessarily, checking the rearview mirror constantly. "And they'll have our license plate." Mark's heart pounded painfully in his chest, the stress overwhelming his medication. "Frank has his own exit strategy. He'll be fine." Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "But this complicates things. Reed will know we're gathering evidence." They rendezvoused with Frank at a 24-hour diner 30 miles from Reed's property. The former officer looked grim as he slid into their booth. "They're definitely running fights tonight," he confirmed, showing them photos captured from his vantage point. "I saw at least 15 dogs being brought in through the service entrance." "We need to call this in," Mark insisted. "Animal cruelty in progress." Frank shook his head. "Local sheriff won't touch it without a warrant, and no judge will issue one based on our surveillance, which, I should mention, is borderline illegal itself." "So we just let it happen?" Sarah's voice rose, drawing glances from the few other late-night patrons. "No," Frank replied calmly. "We take what we have, the flash drive, our photos, your shelter records, to someone who can act on it. I have a contact in the FBI's Animal Crime Unit, but they'll need more than just suspicions and a few grainy photos." "What about Michael?" Mark suggested. "He clearly wants to stop this. Could he testify?" Sarah and Frank exchanged glances. "Possibly," Frank admitted, "if he's willing to risk it." As dawn broke, they parted ways. Frank to contact his FBI connection, Sarah to open the shelter, and Mark to return home to Max, who greeted him with frantic relief after the night's absence. Mark had just settled into his recliner, exhaustion finally overtaking anxiety, when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number. "They know," she said without preamble, her voice shaking. "Reed came to the shelter this morning. He had pictures of us watching the property, of you taking the flash drive from Michael. He said if Max isn't returned by tomorrow night, he'll make sure we all regret it." Mark's blood ran cold. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Not in so many words. He's too smart for that." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mark, I'm scared. These aren't just rich men playing at being criminals. There's serious money involved in these fights, international gambling syndicates." After assuring Sarah he would check in hourly, Mark hung up and immediately called Frank, relaying the new threats. "Stay put," Frank ordered. "I'm coming over. Don't open the door for anyone else." While waiting for Frank, Mark moved methodically through his house, checking locks, closing blinds. Max followed at his heels, sensing the tension. From his garage, Mark retrieved tools that hadn't seen use since retirement: hammers, screwdrivers, a nail gun from his woodworking days. Frank arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by a younger man in civilian clothes who he introduced only as Agent Roberts. "We've been investigating Reed for months," Roberts explained once they were seated in Mark's kitchen. "Interstate gambling, money laundering through the foundation, illegal importation of fighting dogs. But we haven't been able to get close enough for concrete evidence." "Until now," Mark said, placing the flash drive on the table. Roberts nodded. "This helps, but we need more. Direct testimony from someone inside the operation would strengthen our case considerably." "Michael," Mark suggested again, "Reed's assistant." "A logical choice," Roberts agreed, "but approaching him carries risks. If Reed suspects he's cooperating with law enforcement." The implication hung heavily in the air. Mark thought of the young veteran trapped in Reed's operation, clearly wanting out but afraid of consequences. "I'll talk to him," Mark decided. "He trusted me with the flash drive. He might be willing to testify." Frank and Roberts exchanged glances. "That's extremely dangerous," Frank cautioned. Reed's already threatened you directly." Mark looked toward the living room where Max lay watching them attentively. "Some things are worth the risk." As Frank and Roberts discussed logistics, Mark's doorbell rang. Max immediately tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Through the peephole, Mark saw Reed standing on his porch. Not alone this time, but flanked by two men whose bulky jackets likely concealed weapons. "Mr. Wilson?" Reed called through the door. "We need to resolve our business. The deadline has changed." Frank silently drew his concealed handgun while Agent Roberts moved to the side window, peering through a gap in the blinds. "3 men," he confirmed in a whisper. "Reed and 2 others." "Mr. Wilson, I know you're home," Reed called, his voice carrying the false pleasantness that had become familiar. "Your car is in the driveway and the lights are on. Let's discuss this like reasonable men." Mark's pulse thudded in his ears. Max pressed against his leg, hackles raised but silent now, as if understanding the need for stealth. "What do we do?" Mark whispered to Frank. "Stay quiet. I've already texted for backup." Frank positioned himself beside the door, gun at the ready. "If they try to force entry, we've got grounds to defend ourselves." Reed knocked again, more forcefully. "This is becoming tiresome, Mr. Wilson." "I'm trying to be civilized about this." When no response came, they heard a muffled conversation on the porch, followed by retreating footsteps and car doors slamming. Through the window, Roberts watched the black SUV pull away from the curb. "They're leaving," he reported, though his posture remained tense. "For now." Mark sank into the nearest chair, suddenly aware of a sharp pain in his chest. His heart medication. He'd forgotten to take it that morning in the rush of surveillance and aftermath. His breath came in shallow gasps as he fumbled in his pocket for the pill bottle. "Mark!" Frank was at his side instantly. "You okay?" "Just need my—" Mark managed, finally extracting the bottle with trembling fingers. Frank quickly fetched water while Roberts watched the street for any sign of Reed's return. As the medication gradually took effect, Mark's breathing steadied. Max rested his head on Mark's knee, amber eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that suggested genuine concern. "This is escalating too quickly," Roberts said, returning to the kitchen table. "Reed's getting desperate, which makes him dangerous. We need to move you to a safe location until we can build our case." Mark shook his head. "I'm not running, and I'm not leaving Max." "Then we need to accelerate our timeline," Roberts decided. "I'll request emergency surveillance authorization for Reed's compound based on the immediate threat. Frank, can you stay here tonight?" Frank nodded without hesitation. "Already planned on it." After Roberts departed to coordinate with his FBI colleagues, Frank helped Mark secure the house, checking windows, positioning furniture as barriers, creating a safe room in the master bathroom where Mark and Max could retreat if necessary. They worked methodically, Frank's law enforcement experience guiding their preparations. "I never thought my retirement would include barricading myself against dog-fighting criminals," Mark commented wryly as they finished. "Life's full of surprises," Frank replied, attempting to lighten the mood. "Most of mine involved discovering that upstanding citizens were actually scumbags." As evening approached, Sarah called to report that she'd arrived safely at her sister's home in Phoenix. "Reed sent someone to my apartment," she said, voice shaking despite her obvious attempt at composure. "They didn't break in, just left a dog collar on my welcome mat. Max's original collar." The implied threat wasn't subtle. Mark assured her they were taking precautions and urged her to stay away until the situation was resolved. Night fell, bringing a tense quiet to Mark's neighborhood. Frank took the first watch while Mark tried unsuccessfully to rest. Max curled protectively beside him on the bed. Every creak of the house settling, every distant car engine, brought him instantly alert. Around midnight, Mark gave up on sleep entirely. He sat in the darkness of his bedroom, one hand resting on Max's warm fur, and found himself speaking softly to Mary, as he often did in moments of uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm being brave or foolish," he whispered. "You always said I had more principles than sense." Max shifted, pressing closer against Mark's side as if offering comfort. "I keep thinking about what you said near the end, about finding purpose again." Mark continued his one-sided conversation, drawing strength from the familiar ritual. "I never expected it would look like this. Fighting a respected community leader over a dog." The memory of Mary's final week surfaced with unexpected clarity. Her concern not for herself but for him, her insistence that he find something to care about after she was gone. "Promise me you won't just exist," she had urged, her once strong voice barely a whisper. "Find something that matters, Mark." A sudden thought jolted him from his reminiscence. Rising carefully to avoid disturbing Max, Mark retrieved a small box from his closet, Mary's personal effects from her hospital stay. Among them was a leather-bound journal she had kept during her illness. Mark had never found the courage to read it, but now he turned pages by the dim light of his phone until he found what he was seeking: Mary's final entry, dated 3 days before her death. "Mark will need purpose," she had written in increasingly shaky handwriting. "He builds things, not just structures but connections. Without something to build or protect, he'll fade away. I pray he finds something worthy of his heart." Tears blurred Mark's vision as he closed the journal. In that moment, the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks crystallized into resolve. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about standing against cruelty, against the exploitation of the vulnerable, whether animal or human. At dawn, Frank received a call from Roberts. The FBI had obtained emergency surveillance authorization but needed 24 hours to position their teams. Meanwhile, Reed had filed a formal complaint with Animal Control, claiming Mark had stolen his valuable service dog. "An officer will be here within hours with papers demanding the dog's return," Frank explained, his expression grim. "On paper, Reed's ownership claims look legitimate." "Can we fight it legally?" Mark asked. Frank shook his head. "Not immediately. The courts would eventually sort it out, but in the meantime, they'll take Max." The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. After everything, the progress Max had made, the trust they'd built, the truth they'd uncovered, he could lose him today on a legal technicality. "There has to be something we can do," Mark insisted, desperation edging his voice. "There might be," Frank said slowly, "but it's risky. If I call in a few more favors, I might be able to get the responding officer assigned specifically." By mid-morning, a police cruiser pulled into Mark's driveway. Frank watched through the blinds, then relaxed slightly. "It worked. That's Jenkins. He's solid." Officer Jenkins, mid-30s, with the serious demeanor of a career policeman, reviewed the paperwork with professional detachment while Mark held Max's leash with white-knuckled hands. "These appear to be in order, Mr. Wilson," Jenkins stated, his tone revealing nothing. "I'm authorized to take possession of the animal and return it to Mr. Reed immediately." Mark's heart sank. Even with Frank's connection, the law was the law. Then Jenkins continued, his voice dropping slightly. "However, I notice some inconsistencies in the documentation that may require further review. The microchip registration information, for instance, shows multiple transfers of ownership that don't align with Mr. Reed's affidavit." Frank suppressed a smile as Jenkins made a show of examining the papers more carefully. "Additionally," the officer added, "I'm obligated to inform you that my father still talks about that retirement bridge you designed. Says it's the best thing that happened to Veterans Park. His daily walks across that bridge are the highlight of his day." The unexpected personal connection hung in the air for a moment before Jenkins straightened, decision apparently made. I believe these discrepancies warrant a hearing before the animal is transferred. The earliest available date would be next Friday, which gives you 7 days to prepare your case for ownership. Relief flooded through Mark. Thank you, officer. Jenkins maintained his professional demeanor. I'm simply following procedure, sir. I'll note in my report that you were cooperative and that the animal appears well cared for, which will reflect favorably during the hearing. After Jenkins departed, Frank clapped Mark on the shoulder. That buys us time. Roberts and his team should have what they need by then. The reprieve was short-lived. That afternoon, Sarah called in a panic. Mark, someone broke into the shelter last night. They stole all our records on Max and the other dogs from Reed's operation. Were you there? Are you hurt? Mark demanded. No, I was still at my sister's, Sarah assured him. But Mark, they took more than just files. All the evidence we've been gathering, gone. Frank immediately called Roberts, putting the call on speaker so Mark could hear. The FBI agent's response was grim. This complicates things. Without the shelter's documentation establishing the pattern of injured dogs, our case is significantly weakened. We still have the flash drive, but Reed claimed it could be manipulated, Mark interrupted, said it would be my word against his. Not entirely accurate, but not entirely wrong either, Roberts admitted. Digital evidence can be challenged more easily than physical documentation. We need something irrefutable. The situation deteriorated further that evening. Sarah called again, her voice unsteady. I was on my way back from Phoenix, and someone ran me off the road, a black SUV like the ones Reed uses. Are you all right? Mark's grip tightened on his phone. Shaken up. Minor concussion. They're keeping me overnight for observation. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The state trooper who responded said my brake lines had been tampered with. It wasn't an accident, Mark. A cold rage settled in Mark's chest. Different from fear, steadier. Reed was escalating, endangering not just Max, but Sarah and potentially others. This had to end. After consulting with Frank, Mark made a difficult decision. He called Michael, Reed's assistant, using the number Sarah had provided. I need your help, Mark said without preamble when Michael answered. Reed's going after people now, not just dogs. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Mark thought the connection had been lost. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely audible. I can't. He'll know it was me. He already suspects, Mark countered. The flash drive was a mistake, Michael interrupted. I shouldn't have given it to you. You don't understand what he's capable of. Then help me understand, Mark pressed. Help me stop him before someone gets killed. Another long pause. I can't meet you. Not directly, but there's a storage unit on Riverside Drive, Unit 227. The key is hidden above the door frame. What you need is inside. The line went dead. Frank insisted on accompanying Mark to the storage facility. They found the key exactly where Michael had described and opened the padlock with trepidation. The storage unit contained a single file cabinet. Inside were duplicates of the shelter records that had been stolen, along with additional documentation, financial records showing large cash transactions coinciding with fighting events, veterinary bills for injured dogs, even photographs of Reed himself at what appeared to be fighting venues. Michael's been building his own case, Mark realized, planning to break away eventually. Among the files was a sealed envelope addressed to Mark. Inside was a handwritten note. I was one of Reed's success stories once. A veteran with PTSD given purpose through dog training. I didn't see what was happening until I was already complicit. Too late for redemption, but maybe not too late to stop it. Michael. Also enclosed was a key card with office written on it in marker. Frank examined the evidence with growing excitement. This is exactly what Roberts needs: financial records, documentation of interstate transport, even photos placing Reed directly at illegal events. As they carefully packed the files to take to Roberts, Mark's phone rang. The hospital. Sarah had suffered a seizure related to her concussion. Her condition was critical. Mark's world narrowed to a tunnel of grief and rage. Sarah, who had dedicated her life to saving animals from men like her uncle, now fighting for her life because of him. It was unbearable. At the hospital, Mark sat beside Sarah's bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest assisted by machines. Her face, usually animated with compassion and determination, was slack and pale against the white pillows. "I should have protected her better," Mark murmured to Frank, who stood silently by the door. "She trusted me." "This isn't your fault," Frank responded firmly. "This is all Reed. And we're going to make him pay." Mark stayed until visiting hours ended, promising the unconscious Sarah that he would finish what they'd started. As he rose to leave, a nurse touched his arm. "Are you family?" she asked quietly. Mark hesitated. "No, just we work together. With animals." The nurse nodded, understanding. She was conscious briefly earlier, asked for Mark, and said something about keeping Max safe. "I promised I'd tell you." Returning home, Mark found his front door slightly ajar, the lock broken with surgical precision that wouldn't be noticed by casual observation. Frank immediately drew his weapon, signaling Mark to stay back while he cleared the house. "Max?" Mark called once Frank indicated it was safe to enter. "Here, boy!" No answering bark, no click of nails on hardwood. Mark moved frantically from room to room, calling for the German shepherd. The dog bed was empty, the water bowl untouched. In the kitchen, an overturned chair and scattered kibble told the story of a struggle. Max was gone. And on the refrigerator, held by a magnet from Mary's collection, was a note in elegant handwriting. "The consequences of interference. T.R." Mark sank to his knees in the middle of his kitchen floor, surrounded by the evidence of the life he'd built with Max over these few short weeks. The colorful rope toy they'd played with that morning, the special orthopedic bed he'd splurged on despite his limited budget, the pill pockets that made administering Max's anxiety medication easier, all meaningless now. Frank called Roberts immediately, reporting the break-in and Max's abduction, but Mark barely heard their conversation. In his mind, he saw Max back in that fighting ring from the video, terrified and forced to become violent to survive, or worse, Reed might simply eliminate the dog that had become the center of this unwanted attention. "Mark," Frank's voice penetrated his spiral of despair. "Roberts is mobilizing his team now. They'll move on Reed's compound at dawn." "That's not soon enough," Mark replied, rising from the floor with determination born of desperation. "Reed will move Max tonight, either to another location or—" He couldn't complete the thought. "What are you suggesting?" Frank asked cautiously. Mark's gaze fell on the keycard Michael had included with the files. "Office," it read, "likely to Reed's foundation building downtown." "I'm suggesting we don't wait for dawn." Frank stared at Mark with undisguised alarm. "Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." "I'm going to Reed's office," Mark stated, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions within. "The keycard Michael gave us. It has to be for a reason. There might be evidence there that could lead us to Max." "Or it could be a trap," Frank countered. "Reed could be expecting exactly this kind of reaction." Mark pocketed the keycard with steady hands. "Probably. But I can't sit here waiting while Max is in danger." For a moment, Frank looked ready to physically restrain his friend. Then, with a resigned sigh, he holstered his weapon. "If you're determined to do this, you're not doing it alone. But we do it my way. Carefully. With proper backup." An hour later, Mark found himself in the passenger seat of Frank's SUV, parked a block from the Reed Foundation's gleaming glass headquarters. Roberts had reluctantly agreed to provide remote support, monitoring police bands and security systems from his position at the FBI field office. "Remember the plan?" Frank said, checking his weapon one final time. We go in, access the computer system using Michael's credentials, download whatever we can find about Reed's operation, and get out. No confrontations, no heroics. Mark nodded, though his thoughts remained fixed on Max. Where was the German Shepherd now? Was he frightened? Hurt? The questions tormented him with each passing minute. The Reed Foundation building stood dark and imposing against the night sky, its security lights casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. At this late hour, the building appeared deserted, exactly as they'd hoped. Using Michael's keycard, they accessed a side entrance without triggering any visible alarms. The lobby stretched before them, elegant and austere, dominated by a large portrait of Reed in his military uniform, medals gleaming under subtle lighting. "Third floor," Frank whispered, consulting the building directory. "Executive offices." They bypassed the elevators in favor of the stairs, moving quietly despite Mark's protesting knees. Each floor they passed displayed the Foundation's apparent good works: photographs of veterans with service dogs, testimonials from families, awards for community service. The contrast with Reed's secret operation made Mark's stomach churn. The executive floor was secured by another card reader, which again yielded to Michael's key. Reed's office occupied the corner position, offering panoramic views of downtown Tucson through floor-to-ceiling windows. Unlike the meticulously cultivated public spaces, this room revealed a more complex character: military memorabilia alongside luxury items, precisely arranged furniture suggesting a need for control. Frank immediately went to work on Reed's computer, while Mark searched through file cabinets, looking for anything related to the dogfighting operation, or, more urgently, Max's current location. "The computer's locked," Frank reported, frustration evident in his whisper. "Michael's credentials don't work here." Mark continued his methodical search, carefully maintaining the original order of files to avoid detection. In the bottom drawer of a lateral cabinet, sealed in a manila envelope marked "Personal," he found a stack of photographs that turned his blood cold. The images documented Reed's progression from decorated soldier to criminal, a visual history of his descent. Early photos showed him with his military unit, proud and purposeful. Later ones captured him with increasingly dubious associates at what appeared to be fighting venues around the world. More disturbing were the medical records interspersed with the photos: VA hospital visits for PTSD symptoms, prescriptions for psychiatric medications, and finally a letter denying Reed's request for intensive inpatient treatment due to insufficient resources and overwhelming demand. "Frank," Mark called softly, holding up the documents. "I think I found something important." Before Frank could respond, the office light suddenly blazed to life. In the doorway stood Thomas Reed, flanked by two security guards. His expression registered no surprise, only a cold satisfaction. "Mr. Wilson, breaking and entering now? How disappointing." Reed gestured to his guards. "Secure Mr. Miller's weapon, please." Frank reached for his gun but froze as one guard drew his own, aiming steadily. "Don't be foolish, Frank," Reed advised. "I have no desire for bloodshed in my office, too difficult to explain to the cleaning staff." After a tense moment, Frank slowly raised his hands, allowing the second guard to remove his weapon. "Where's the dog, Reed?" "Safe," Reed replied dismissively. "Unlike you two at the moment." He moved to his desk, seating himself with the casual confidence of a man in complete control. "I must admit I'm impressed by your persistence, Mr. Wilson. Most men your age would have surrendered by now." Mark clutched the envelope of photos and documents. "Most men haven't seen what you're doing." "And what exactly do you think you've seen?" Reed leaned forward, eyes hardening. "A successful business? A foundation that helps hundreds of veterans annually? Or perhaps you're referring to my specialized training program, the one that provides elite protection dogs to clients who can afford them." "I've seen dogs forced to fight to the death," Mark replied steadily. I've seen the scars on Max, or Thor, as you called him. I've seen the trauma in his eyes when he hears certain sounds or commands. Reed waved a dismissive hand. Dramatic interpretations from a lonely old man projecting his emotions onto an animal. Thor was being trained for very specific security work. His temperament proved unsuitable, too soft for the demands of the job. "Is that why you tried to kill Sarah?" Frank demanded. "Because she saw dogs being trained?" A flicker of genuine emotion, perhaps regret, crossed Reed's face before his mask of control returned. "My niece's accident was unfortunate. Her brake lines were apparently in poor condition." "Cut, you mean?" Mark corrected, anger rising. "Just like you cut her out of your life when she questioned your methods." Reed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sarah chose her path. I offered her understanding of the bigger picture, but she insisted on clinging to simplistic moral judgments." "Much like you're doing now." "Where is Max?" Mark demanded, stepping forward despite the guard's warning gestures. "The dog is where he belongs, with professionals who understand his value and purpose." Reed rose, circling his desk to stand directly before Mark. Despite their similar heights, Reed's military bearing made him seem taller, more imposing. "You have nothing but emotional attachment. I have legal ownership documents, specialized training investment, and a legitimate business utilizing his genetic qualities." Mark held up the envelope. "And I have evidence of what you're really doing. PTSD that went untreated, gambling operations across state lines, fighting venues disguised as training facilities." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Reed's expression. "Where did you get those?" "Someone who knows what you're doing is wrong," Mark replied. "Someone close to you who can't stomach it anymore." Reed's composure fractured slightly. "Michael," he breathed, realization dawning, "always too soft for this business." "He respected you once," Mark pressed, sensing a vulnerability. "Looked up to you as a fellow veteran who understood what he'd been through." "He understands nothing," Reed snapped, mask slipping further. "None of you do. What it takes to come back from what we've seen, what we've done, the nightmares, the constant vigilance, the inability to feel anything except through extremes." His voice had risen, color flooding his face. "The VA turned you away," Mark said softly, indicating the denial letter visible among the documents. "When you needed help." Reed's laugh was bitter. "They offered group therapy once a month and prescriptions that turned me into a zombie. I lost everything coming back. My marriage, my peace of mind, my future. The only thing that worked was the adrenaline, the rush of risk and dominance." "So you transferred that to dogs," Frank interjected. "Made them fight your battles." "I created something out of nothing," Reed corrected sharply. "A business that supports dozens of veterans who would otherwise be homeless or suicidal. Yes, some aspects operate in gray areas legally, but the foundation's work is real. The lives saved are real." "At what cost?" Mark challenged. "How many dogs destroyed? How many people threatened or injured to protect your operation?" Reed's expression hardened once more. "An acceptable ratio of sacrifice to benefit. The world isn't black and white, Mr. Wilson. Sometimes darkness serves a greater purpose." "Where is Max?" Mark repeated, refusing to be diverted. Reed studied him with something approaching respect. "Your loyalty to that dog is admirable, if misplaced. He's at my training facility being prepared for transport to an overseas client. By morning he'll be on his way to a new life." "As a fighting dog," Mark concluded grimly. "As a valuable asset," Reed corrected. "His bloodline is exceptional. His training foundation solid despite your attempts to undo it." Mark felt the weight of his years, the arthritis in his joints, the weakness in his heart that medication barely controlled. What chance did he have against Reed and his operation? Yet giving up meant consigning Max to a life of violence and fear, everything the dog had begun to overcome in their brief time together. "I'll pay you," Mark offered desperately. "Whatever your overseas client is offering, I'll match it." Reed's laugh held genuine amusement. "With what? Your Social Security checks? The dog is worth $50,000 minimum." The figure staggered Mark. His entire remaining savings wouldn't cover a quarter of that amount. "This has gone on long enough," Reed decided, nodding to his guards. "Escort these gentlemen out. Ensure they understand that any further interference will have serious legal consequences." He turned back to Mark. "Consider yourself fortunate that I'm not pressing charges for breaking and entering. My reputation can withstand scrutiny, but I doubt your retirement fund could handle legal fees." As the guards moved forward, Mark made a split-second decision. He lunged toward Reed's desk, grabbing the letter opener, an ornate military dagger, and pressed it against the envelope of documents. "Call your facility," Mark demanded, voice steady despite his racing heart. "Tell them to stand down, to keep Max there until authorities arrive, or I destroy these right now." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. Those are copies." "Some are," Mark acknowledged. "But the medical records? The original photos with metadata showing locations and dates? The VA denial with your personal notes in the margins about alternative treatments? All originals, apparently too personal or incriminating to leave in Michael's storage unit." Uncertainty flickered across Reed's face as he assessed the situation. "You won't get out of here with those." "I don't need to," Mark replied. "The FBI already has copies of most of it. Agent Roberts is moving on your rural property at dawn. All I need is to ensure Max is still there when they arrive." For a long moment, the office was silent except for the soft hum of the climate control system. Then Reed slowly reached for his phone. "Stand down the transport," he ordered someone on the other end. "Delay until further notice." After disconnecting, he fixed Mark with a cold stare. "Satisfied? Though I wonder what you think this accomplishes. By morning, those documents will be ash. Your word against mine regarding this conversation, and my legal team will ensure the FBI's warrant finds nothing incriminating." Mark carefully lowered the letter opener but kept the envelope clutched to his chest. "Maybe. But Max will still be there, not on a plane to become someone's fighting machine." "Your sentimentality over a dog is pathetic," Reed said dismissively, "but ultimately harmless. Take him out," he instructed the guards. "Both of them." As the guards moved forward, Mark's phone rang, the specific tone he'd assigned to emergency contacts. With a questioning glance at Reed, who nodded permission, Mark answered. "Mr. Wilson?" A nurse's voice, tense and hurried. "It's about Sarah Mitchell. Her condition has deteriorated suddenly. The doctor thinks you should come quickly if you want to say goodbye." The phone nearly slipped from Mark's suddenly numb fingers. "I'll be right there," he managed, disconnecting. "Bad news?" Reed inquired, his tone suggesting he already knew. "Sarah," Mark replied, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. "She's dying." Something shifted in Reed's expression, a flash of genuine emotion before the mask returned. "My niece has always had a flair for the dramatic. I'm sure she'll recover." "She's the only family you have left," Mark pressed, watching carefully for reactions. "After your parents, your failed marriage—" "Enough," Reed snapped. "Take your leave, Mr. Wilson. Our business is concluded for tonight." As the guards escorted them from the building, Frank maintained a protective position beside Mark, who still clutched the envelope of documents. Neither spoke until they were back in Frank's vehicle driving toward the hospital. "That was a dangerous game you played in there," Frank finally said. "Reed could have called your bluff." "It wasn't entirely a bluff," Mark replied, opening the envelope to reveal the original documents mixed with photographed copies. "And I needed to buy time for Max." "You really think Reed will keep his word? That dog could be gone by morning anyway." Mark stared out at the passing streetlights. I don't know. But something changed when I mentioned Sarah. There's still some humanity in him, buried deep under whatever the war did to him. At the hospital, they found Sarah's condition indeed critical. The brain swelling from her concussion had increased suddenly, requiring emergency surgery. The prognosis was uncertain at best. Mark sat beside her bed in the ICU, holding her limp hand while machines monitored every life function. So young, so dedicated to helping animals others had discarded. The unfairness of it burned in his throat. "I'll find Max," he promised her unconscious form. "And I'll make sure Reed pays for what he's done, to the dogs, to you, to all of it." As midnight approached, Frank received a call from Roberts. "The raid is moved up," he reported after disconnecting. "They're going in at 2 a.m. instead of dawn. Anonymous tip suggested Reed might be moving evidence tonight." "Can we be there?" Mark asked immediately. Frank hesitated. "Roberts strongly advised against it." But he didn't explicitly forbid it. We could observe from a safe distance." Mark glanced at Sarah's pale face, the tubes and wires connecting her to life support. "I need to be there. For her. For Max." After extracting a promise from Mark to remain in the vehicle and follow all instructions, Frank drove them to a designated observation point near Reed's rural property. By the time they arrived, FBI vehicles were already staging in a nearby field, agents receiving final briefings before the raid. Roberts approached their car, his expression a mixture of resignation and understanding when he saw Mark. "I should have known you wouldn't stay away." "Is it happening?" Mark asked, ignoring the implied criticism. Roberts nodded. "Teams are in position. We're moving in 15 minutes. The warrant covers every building on the property with specific focus on the training facility and the structure we believe houses the fighting venue." "And Max?" Mark couldn't keep the desperate hope from his voice. "If he's there, we'll find him," Roberts promised. "But Mr. Wilson, you need to prepare yourself. Dogs used in these operations are sometimes not in good condition." The implication sent ice through Mark's veins. "Reed wouldn't damage valuable merchandise," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Roberts. "He said Max was worth $50,000. Roberts' expression softened slightly. "We'll do our best. Now, stay in the vehicle, both of you. This could get complicated." Through night vision binoculars provided by Frank, Mark watched the FBI teams advance on the property, dark figures moving with precision through the trees surrounding Reed's compound. The operation began with surprising quietness. No sirens, no shouted commands, just the synchronized movement of agents breaching various entry points simultaneously. Then chaos erupted. Floodlights blazed across the property, a security system apparently triggered despite the FBI's precautions. Shouts echoed across the distance, followed by the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. "They're meeting resistance," Frank narrated, his experienced eye tracking the patterns of movement. "Not heavy, but definitely not full cooperation." Mark strained to see through the binoculars, desperately searching for any sign of Max among the confusion of movement. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, each beat a reminder of his physical frailty in this moment when he needed strength most. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only 20 minutes, Roberts returned to their vehicle, his expression grim. "We've secured the property. Found everything. Fighting ring, training equipment, financial records, even a digital system tracking bets and payouts." "And Max?" Mark asked, dreading the answer. Roberts hesitated. "We found several dogs, including German shepherds. But Mr. Wilson, there's no sign of one matching Max's description and microchip number. Reed must have moved him despite the order to stand down." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mark, grief and rage warring for dominance. After everything, the investigation, the threats, Sarah's injury, the confrontation with Reed, Max was gone, transported to face a life of violence from which Mark had so briefly rescued him. "There's something else," Roberts continued reluctantly. "Reed isn't here. According to the staff we've detained, he never returned from the Foundation office tonight." Frank immediately started the engine. "We need to go. Now!" As they pulled away, Mark stared back at the illuminated compound, now swarming with law enforcement. They had won, in a sense, Reed's operation exposed, his crimes documented, his business destroyed. But the victory felt hollow without Max. Where could Reed have taken him? Mark wondered aloud, despair threatening to overwhelm him. Frank's phone rang, the sound startlingly loud in the tense silence of the vehicle. He answered via speakerphone, keeping his eyes on the road. "Frank Miller," he identified himself. "Frank." The voice belonged to Officer Jenkins. "I thought you should know. Thomas Reed was just brought into the station. Turned himself in, surrendered his passport, everything. Said he'd provide full cooperation in exchange for consideration during sentencing." Mark and Frank exchanged shocked glances. "Did he say why?" Frank asked. "Something about family obligations," Jenkins replied. "And there's something else. He brought a dog with him, German Shepherd, answers to both Thor and Max, asked specifically that we contact Mr. Wilson to come claim him." Mark stood outside the police station, his heart pounding with anticipation and disbelief. Frank placed a steadying hand on his shoulder as they approached the entrance, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. "Take it easy," Frank cautioned. "We don't know what condition Max is in, or what Reed's angle might be." Mark nodded, unable to trust his voice. After the emotional roller coaster of the past days, Sarah's injury, the raid on Reed's property, the confrontation in the office, this unexpected development felt almost like a dream. He half expected to wake up at any moment, alone in his house with Max still missing. Officer Jenkins met them in the lobby, his professional demeanor softened slightly by the unusual circumstances. "Mr. Wilson, Mr. Miller, thank you for coming so quickly." "Where is he?" Mark asked, the question bursting forth before pleasantries could be exchanged. "The dog is in our break room," Jenkins replied. "Animal Control wanted to take him to their facility, but Reed insisted he remain here until you arrived, said something about the dog not responding well to strangers in uniform." Jenkins led them through the station, past curious officers and administrative staff. Mark caught snippets of conversation. Reed's name, mentions of the FBI raid, speculation about the prominent citizen's sudden surrender. The break room door stood partially open. Jenkins gestured for Mark to enter first while he and Frank remained in the hallway, offering privacy for the reunion. Mark stepped into the room, his breath catching at the sight before him. Max, his Max, lay curled on a blanket in the corner, head resting on paws, amber eyes alert and watching the door. For a heartbeat, neither moved. "Max?" Mark called softly, his voice breaking. The German Shepherd's head lifted instantly, ears perking forward. A moment of recognition passed between them, and then Max was moving, not the tentative approach of their early days together, but a joyful rush across the room. Mark dropped to his knees, ignoring the protest of aging joints as Max reached him, tail whipping back and forth with unprecedented enthusiasm. The dog pressed against him, whining softly, sniffing Mark's clothes and face as if confirming his identity through scent. "I thought I'd lost you, boy," Mark whispered, burying his face in the thick fur of Max's neck. The dog's solid warmth beneath his hands felt like a miracle. Real, alive, unharmed. After several minutes of reunion, Frank gently cleared his throat from the doorway. "Jenkins says we can take Max home whenever you're ready. All the paperwork's been handled." Mark reluctantly rose to his feet, keeping one hand on Max's head. "What about Reed? I want to talk to him." Jenkins and Frank exchanged glances. He's being processed, Jenkins explained. Given formal charges based on evidence from the FBI raid, but he did ask if you would speak with him before he's transferred to federal custody. A complex mixture of emotions churned in Mark's stomach: anger, confusion, lingering fear, and underneath it all, a need to understand. I'll see him. Max refused to leave Mark's side, pressing against his leg as they walked through the station corridors. Jenkins explained that Reed had specifically requested the dog be present for their conversation, a request granted only because of the unusual circumstances. We'll be monitoring, Jenkins assured them as they approached the interview room. Standard procedure. Reed sat at a metal table, hands cuffed before him. His tailored suit had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His military posture diminished, but not entirely absent. He looked up as Mark entered with Max, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Mr. Wilson?" "Thank you for coming." His voice remained controlled, though lacking its usual commanding tone. Mark took the seat across from Reed, Max settling vigilantly at his feet. "Why did you bring him back?" Reed's gaze shifted to the German shepherd, who returned his look without cowering. A marked change from the fearful animal Mark had first encountered at the shelter. "I visited Sarah at the hospital before turning myself in," Reed said, surprising Mark with this unexpected revelation. "The doctors say her prognosis is guarded but promising. The surgery was successful." Mark waited, sensing there was more. "She was semi-conscious," Reed continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Do you know what she asked me? Not why I had done what I did, not even about her own condition. She asked about the dogs, whether they were safe." A bitter smile twisted his lips. Even facing death, her concern was for them. "Just like her mother, my sister." Mark remembered Sarah mentioning her mother had died young. "Your sister would be proud of her daughter." "Yes." Reed's gaze dropped to his cuffed hands. "Elizabeth always saw the best in everyone, everything. She would be ashamed of what I've become." Max shifted at Mark's feet, drawing Reed's attention again. "He looks different with you. Calmer." "I wouldn't have thought it possible, given his training." "He just needed patience," Mark replied, "and to feel safe." Reed nodded slowly. "Things I couldn't provide." "Not anymore. Not after—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely with his cuffed hands, encompassing perhaps the war, his PTSD, the path that had led him to this interview room. "Why did you bring him back?" Mark repeated his original question. "Sarah made me promise," Reed admitted. "But that's not the only reason." He leaned forward slightly. "When you showed me those documents in my office, my medical records, the VA rejections, I realized how far I'd fallen. Using the same methods on animals that had been used on me in combat training, becoming what I once fought against." Mark remained silent, allowing Reed to continue. "The Foundation's legitimate work will continue," Reed said after a moment. "The board has been instructed to reorganize without me, to focus exclusively on pairing service dogs with veterans through proper channels. I've provided prosecutors with names of everyone involved in the fighting circuit: buyers, trainers, gamblers. In exchange for a reduced sentence," Mark guessed. Reed's smile held no humor. "In exchange for nothing. My lawyers advised against it, but some debts can't be negotiated away." His gaze dropped to Max again. "This dog, Thor, Max, whatever you call him now, he was my best trainee once. Perfect genetics, ideal temperament for the work. Until he started refusing commands, showing empathy rather than aggression. I should have recognized myself in him. What I was before war twisted everything." The conversation fell into silence, heavy with unspoken history and regret. Finally, Reed straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. I've signed legal ownership of Max over to you, Mr. Wilson. All his original documentation, breeding records, everything. No one will contest your claim again. Thank you, Mark said simply, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. Reed nodded once, formally. There's a private account set up for Sarah's medical expenses and rehabilitation. Anonymous, untraceable to me or my operation. The paperwork is with my lawyer. He hesitated, then added, and a separate fund for Max's care. Dogs like him require specialized veterinary attention sometimes, given their history. Mark studied the man across from him, still proud, still controlled, yet fundamentally changed from the imperious figure who had threatened him on his doorstep days earlier. Why the change of heart, Reed? Really? When I saw Sarah in that hospital bed, Reed replied slowly, I remembered who I used to be. Before the things I saw and did overseas, before I started seeing every living thing as either useful or expendable. His gaze met Mark's directly. I remember building things once. Now all I do is destroy. The words struck an unexpected chord in Mark, echoing his own feelings after retirement, after Mary's death. The sense of purpose lost, of identity unmoored. It's never too late to rebuild, Mark said quietly. Reed's bitter laugh held the first hint of genuine emotion. Tell that to the federal prosecutor. I'm looking at 15 years minimum. I meant rebuild yourself, Mark clarified. The foundation, the legal consequences, that's just structure. The blueprint is what matters. Something shifted in Reed's expression, recognition, perhaps, or respect. The bridge designer, always thinking in metaphors. Their time was clearly coming to an end as Jenkins appeared at the door, indicating that Reed was due for transfer. As Mark rose to leave, Max at his side, Reed spoke one final time. He responds to a different command set now, gentle tones, English only. The German attack commands were deliberately traumatic, designed to trigger aggression through fear. Reed's clinical tone couldn't quite mask the regret underneath. The training manual is with my lawyer. It might help you understand what triggers to avoid. Mark nodded his thanks, turning to leave. Mr. Wilson, Reed called, stopping him at the threshold. Take care of him. He deserves better than what I gave him. So did you, Mark replied softly, and left with Max padding faithfully beside him. 6 months passed in a blur of healing and rebuilding. Sarah recovered gradually from her injuries, though occasional headaches and memory lapses remained as reminders of her brush with death. She returned to work at the shelter with renewed purpose, implementing programs specifically designed for rehabilitating fighting dogs. Mark and Max settled into a comfortable routine that brought joy to both of them. Daily walks strengthened Mark's heart while helping Max overcome his lingering anxieties. The training manual Reed had provided proved invaluable in identifying and avoiding triggers that might cause regression. Frank visited regularly, often bringing his newly adopted rescue dog, a one-eared pit bull mix saved from Reed's compound during the raid. Never thought I'd be a dog person, he admitted to Mark one afternoon as they watched their pets play together in the backyard. Guess you're never too old to change. Reed's trial proceeded swiftly, his full cooperation eliminating the need for lengthy proceedings. He received a 12-year sentence, less than expected due to his assistance in dismantling fighting operations across 3 states. Mark attended the sentencing, a decision that surprised even himself. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Reed offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but recognition of a shared understanding. The most unexpected development came through Michael, Reed's former assistant. After testifying against his former employer, he approached Mark with a proposition, expanding the legitimate side of Reed's business into a full-scale rehabilitation program for both traumatized dogs and veterans. "We could do it right this time," Michael explained earnestly over coffee in Mark's kitchen, Max watching attentively from his new bed by the window. "Use your construction knowledge to build proper facilities, my experience with training, Sarah's expertise with rescued animals." The idea took root, growing from conversation to concept to reality. Mark found himself drawing plans again. Not skyscrapers this time, but training spaces designed with both canine and human healing in mind. His retirement savings, supplemented by the fund Reed had established for Max, provided seed money for the project. They named it Second Chance Training Center and held a modest, groundbreaking ceremony on a piece of land purchased from the county at a favorable rate, thanks to Officer Jenkins's father serving on the zoning commission. Sarah, now walking with only a slight limp, turned the first shovelful of dirt while Max watched from Mark's side, no longer requiring a leash to stay close. Local media covered the event, focusing on the redemptive narrative of rescued fighting dogs becoming therapy animals for veterans struggling with PTSD. Mark, uncomfortable in the spotlight, deflected attention to Sarah and Michael, though he couldn't entirely avoid interviews as the project's chief designer. "What inspired you to get involved?" a young reporter asked him as the ceremony concluded. Mark's hand dropped automatically to Max's head, finding comfort in the solid warmth beneath his palm. "Sometimes you save something, and sometimes it saves you," he replied simply. Construction progressed through autumn and into winter, with Mark on site daily despite the occasional flare-up of his arthritis. There was something profoundly satisfying about watching physical structures rise from his blueprints again, tangible evidence of creation rather than destruction. On a crisp December morning, Mark received a letter forwarded through Reed's lawyer. The handwriting was precise, military neat on prison stationery. "Mr. Wilson," it began formally, "reports of your training center have reached me through approved news sources. The concept appears sound, particularly the focus on rehabilitation rather than repurposing. The enclosed suggestions regarding facility security and noise reduction for anxiety-prone animals are offered without expectation or obligation." The pages that followed contained detailed notes on design modifications that showed genuine insight into both canine psychology and the needs of veterans with PTSD. Mark studied them carefully, incorporating several into revised blueprints, despite Frank's initial skepticism about accepting input from Reed. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day," Mark pointed out pragmatically. "And these are good ideas regardless of their source." As winter yielded to spring, the Second Chance Center neared completion. The first group of dogs, 7 survivors from various fighting operations across the state, arrived for assessment and rehabilitation. Max, now certified as a therapy dog, helped introduce the newcomers to their temporary home, his calm presence seeming to reassure even the most traumatized animals. The first veterans entered the program shortly thereafter, 5 men and 2 women, each carrying invisible wounds alongside their visible ones. Mark observed their initial interactions with the dogs from a distance, recognizing in their guarded postures and vigilant gazes something of Max's early days with him. "It takes time," he advised Michael when the younger man expressed frustration at the slow progress. "Trust isn't built overnight, especially when it's been broken before." Gradually, partnerships formed between specific veterans and dogs, each seeming to recognize something in the other that resonated with their own experiences. A former Marine with a prosthetic leg bonded with a 3-legged German Shepherd. A Navy corpsman who flinched at loud noises found connection with a Rottweiler who shared the same trigger. Sarah developed a structured program combining conventional therapy with animal interaction, drawing on research showing the physiological benefits of the human-animal bond in treating PTSD. Success stories accumulated slowly but steadily. Veterans reporting improved sleep, reduced anxiety, greater willingness to engage in social situations when accompanied by their canine partners. On the center's official opening day, a small ceremony honored those who had made it possible. Mark found himself at the podium despite his best efforts to avoid public speaking, Max sitting attentively at his feet as he addressed the gathered supporters, staff, and participants. "This center stands because of many people's efforts," he began, voice steady despite his nervousness. "Sarah's vision, Michael's expertise, Frank's support, and countless others who believed in second chances." His gaze swept the assembled faces, pausing briefly on an empty chair in the front row where he had requested a space be reserved. Not for Reed, the man remained in federal prison serving his sentence, but for the person Reed might have become under different circumstances. "We all carry scars," Mark continued. "Some visible, some hidden. What matters isn't that we're wounded, but that we're healing. Not that we've fallen, but that we're rising again." As he spoke, his hand dropped to Max's head in what had become an unconscious gesture of mutual reassurance. The German shepherd leaned slightly against his leg, a warm, solid presence, grounding him in the present moment. "I came to this project as a retired builder who thought his constructing days were over," Mark admitted. "What I've learned is that we never stop building. Relationships, trust, new beginnings. Sometimes the most important structures aren't made of steel and concrete, but of patience and understanding." After the ceremony, Mark escaped the continuing celebrations to sit quietly on a bench in the center's memorial garden, dedicated to both veterans and animals who hadn't survived their respective battles. Max settled beside him, head resting on his knee in companionable silence. "We did good, boy," Mark murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. "Mary would have approved." The German shepherd's tail thumped against the wooden bench in agreement. As sunset painted the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From lonely retirement to reluctant dog owner to advocate and builder again. All because he'd noticed some unusual scars on a frightened shelter dog. A soft whine from Max drew his attention back to the present. The German shepherd had risen to his feet, alert but not alarmed, tail wagging in greeting as Sarah approached along the garden path. "Thought I might find you hiding out here," she said with a smile, easing herself onto the bench beside him. Her limp was barely noticeable now, though she still tired more easily than before her injury. "Just taking it all in," Mark replied, gesturing to the center building silhouetted against the sunset. "Hard to believe it all started with this one." He patted Max's side affectionately. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I got another letter from Uncle Thomas today. He's been accepted into the prison's dog training program, the legitimate kind, rehabilitating shelter dogs for adoption." Mark raised an eyebrow in surprise. "That's unexpected." "People can change," Sarah said simply. "Not all of them, not completely, but enough to matter." As darkness settled over the desert, they made their way back toward the center, now illuminated against the night. Through the windows, Mark could see veterans and dogs together in the common room, some actively engaged in training exercises, others simply sitting in companionable silence, each drawing comfort from the other's presence. Max walked between Mark and Sarah, occasionally glancing up as if to ensure they were still there. His gait was confident now, his posture relaxed, no longer the frightened animal cowering in a shelter kennel or the tense fighting dog from Reed's training facility. "You know," Sarah commented as they reached the main building, "when I first showed you Max at the shelter, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Mark smiled, resting his hand on Max's head as the dog leaned comfortably against his leg. Sometimes the most broken souls, human or animal, just need someone who refuses to give up on them. Max looked up at him with trusting eyes that held no trace of their former fear, and Mark felt a profound sense of rightness settle in his chest. Not just the companionship he'd sought in adopting a dog, but the purpose Mary had wanted him to find. Building something meaningful again, creating safe spaces where healing could happen. He had set out to save a dog, never expecting that the dog would save him in return. When Mark Wilson reluctantly opened his door to a frightened German shepherd, he had no idea this broken soul would rebuild his own. At 68, Mark thought his building days were over. His wife Mary gone, his career finished, his purpose lost. But Max's scars told a story that demanded action, pulling Mark from isolation into a fight against cruelty that rekindled his spirit. Their journey wasn't just about saving one dog, but rediscovering what Mary had always known: it's never too late to matter again. Through Max, Mark built something more meaningful than any skyscraper, a community of healing for both animals and veterans where broken souls could find strength in each other. We all face moments when life seems diminished, when purpose feels distant. But Mark's story reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected connections lead us back to ourselves. Has an animal ever changed your life in ways you never anticipated? Or what new purpose have you discovered in your retirement years that surprised you? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the reminder that second chances exist at any age.